Hello, Mike Cook here, and I'm happy to bring you another edition of Anti-Doping Updates. This is episode 15. Today, we've got the story of a minor football player. We've got the story of a Kenyan runner who took prescription medicine outside of his prescription. And we've got the story of a Peruvian swimmer who is sanctioned for a second anti-doping rule violation. Okay, let's get started. The first story is about YF, who is a young football player from England. By football, I'm talking about this kind of football. He's not named in any of the decisions because he's a minor. His name is redacted, and so is the name of his club. So I can't sleuth around and figure out who this person is. But he plays with one of the football clubs in the Premier League of England, and the Premier League is part of the FA, the Football Association, and that is a part of FIFA, which is a signatory to the World Anti-Doping Code. So he's subject to the World Anti-Doping Code. At the time, he was only 15 years of age, and he was residing with a host family because the club that he played for is closer to his host family than it was to his parents' home. So he had his own fridge in his own room, and he didn't share the room with anyone. And the host family, in cleaning it up, I guess, found some pen-type dispensers with needles in his room. She reported it to the club, who reported it to the FA disciplinary body, and they did an investigation into this case. As part of the investigation, they got copies. There were some of these pen-type dispensers left over, and they tested it, and it tested positive for somatropin. Somatropin is a human growth hormone, prohibited at all times by the World Anti-Doping Code. Does have some medical uses for children with growth failure and adults with wasting due to AIDS, and for chronic kidney failure, but most of the time it's used off-label for bodybuilding and physique and muscle building. In the investigation, YF and his parents had several different stories about these pens and how they were in his possession. First, YF said they weren't his, he didn't know about them. Second, he said that there was a mix-up and that he brought his cousin's bag to the host family instead of his own, and this was his cousin's, and that contained the dispenser. Then the next story, he said, was that the pen dispensers were his father's, and his father was using the somatropin to treat depression, and he made up the story about the cousin and the cousin's bag to save the father from embarrassment. Lastly, he admitted that he bought the pen dispenser from a friend, bought it from a car park, and the friend had bought it legally in Turkey, but he refused to name the name of the friend that he bought it from. Also, in the course of the examination, the disciplinary commission of the FA sent an email to his attorney asking for to turn over his phone for imaging so they could see what text messages had gone on. 2 days later, YF reported that his phone had been stolen and that is not available for imaging. So this case brings up a new provision in the World Anti-Doping Code about protected persons. And here's what the new provision says. Where the anti-doping rule violation is not involving a substance of abuse, is committed by a protected person or recreational athlete, and the protected person or recreational athlete can establish no significant fault or negligence, then the period of ineligibility shall be, at a minimum, a reprimand, and no period of ineligibility, and at a maximum of 2 years ineligibility, depending upon the protected person or recreational athlete's degree of fault. So the FA argued that this case was an intentional violation and subject to a 4-year sanction, and that provision that I just read wouldn't apply. they argued, and YF argued that he had no significant fault or negligence and should have a reduced period of ineligibility. So the first issue is intentional or not. And for the purposes of the World Anti-Doping Code, intentional means that the individual knew that there was a significant risk that the conduct might constitute or result in an anti-doping rule violation and manifestly disregarded that risk. No fault or negligence means that the individual did not know or suspect and could not have reasonably known or suspected, even with the exercise of utmost caution, that their conduct would not cause an anti-doping rule violation. Fault means any breach of duty or lack of care appropriate to a particular situation. No significant fault or negligence means the participant is able to establish that his fault or negligence, when viewed in totality of the circumstances, taking into account the criteria for fault or negligence, was not significant in relationship to the anti-doping rule violation. So that's the criteria that the disciplinary commission had to look at. They decided that the regulatory commission had proved that YF was in possession of it. They found that there wasn't sufficient proof that he'd actually used the substance, and they found that they could not, that there should be no adverse inference from not handing over the phone. So, turning first towards intentional or not, the commission found that YF was not acting intentionally because he had not yet received any anti-doping rule violations. So there's no proof that he knew that using this pen type of dispenser could cause an anti-doping rule violation. However, they found that there was some degree of fault or negligence, but it was no significant fault or negligence. They found that because he hadn't done an internet search or tried to figure out what was in the pen dispenser, there's some degree of fault. So instead of sanctioning him for the full period of time, the Football Association sanctioned him for 9 months. And so that's the result of that case. Okay, second case to talk about involves the issue of what happens when you use a prescribed, out of competition medication, but you use it in competition. Nicholas Kiptu Koseji, he is a 26-year-old road runner from Kenya. He's ranked 589th in the world. In 2019, he participated in the Corrida Internacional de São Silvestre in Sao Paulo, Brazil, and that was an event sanctioned by World Athletics. And in February, he placed second in the Meia Maratona de Sao Paulo, which is in Sao Paulo, Brazil. That's a half marathon, and his time was 1 hour and 5 minutes. He submitted urine samples at both races, and the sample from both races tested positive for prednisone. Prednisone is a glucocorticoid medication used mostly to suppress the immune system and decrease inflammation in conditions such as asthma, COPD, and rheumatologic diseases. It's a specified substance under the World Anti-Doping Code, meaning it is prohibited in competition only. So the Athletics Integrity Unit is the part of the World Athletics that does the results management for anti-doping cases. When they notified Koseji of the adverse analytical finding, his explanation was that in December of 2019, he went to a clinic in Kenya for joint pain and was prescribed prednisone twice a day for 5 days. He also said that he had some of that left over, and he took 1 tablet the day before the second race, the Sao Paulo half marathon. So the first issue for the AIU to consider was whether this should be considered an intentional violation. An intentional, according to the World Anti-Doping Code, means the athlete engaged in conduct that he new constituted an anti-doping rule violation, or that there is a significant risk of an anti-doping rule violation and manifestly disregarded the risk. And because prednisone is considered a specified substance and not likely to use to cause an increase in sport performance, the AIU concluded that Kosegi's violation was not intentional. So the next issue is whether or not there should be a reduction of the sanction due to no fault or negligence or no significant fault or negligence. Fault means any breach of care appropriate to the particular situation. Specifically, what an individual is expected to do according to the World Anti-Doping Violation, or according to the World Anti-Doping Code, is read the label of the product used or otherwise ascertain the ingredients, cross-check all the ingredients on the label against the list of prohibited substances, and there's a website that helps you do that, make an internet search of the product, ensure that the product is reliably sourced, and consult appropriate experts in such matters and instruct them diligently before consuming the product. So the AIU noted that Kosegi didn't do any of those things, and also noted that he's not in the registered testing pool and not in the AIU monitoring pool, so that was on the other hand, and that he's only competed in a few international races over the past years. So given that, they found that he had no significant fault, and instead of sanctioning him for 2 years, they sanctioned him for 16 months. Okay, last story to talk about is the swimmer who has a second anti-doping rule violation. This is Mauricio Fiol Villanueva. He is a swimmer from Peru. He competed in the 2012 London Olympics and placed 25th in the 200-meter butterfly. In 2015, he submitted an in-competition sample at the 2015 Pan Am Games in Toronto, where he won the silver medal in the 200-meter butterfly. That sample tested positive for stanozolol, and he was sanctioned. So he appealed the finding all the way up to the Court for Arbitration of Sport, but his sanction was upheld. He was sanctioned for 4 years for that violation in 2015. So from 2015 to 2019, he was sanctioned. Athletes who are sanctioned and wanting to compete after their sanction are still in a registered testing pool, and they still have to be tested. And that's what happened to him. From June to September of 2019, he submitted 6 out-of-competition samples for testing. Each of those tested positive for stanozolol. Stanozolol, remember, this is the same substance he tested positive for in 2015 and was banned for 4 years. It's an anabolic steroid prohibited in competition and out of competition by the World Anti-Doping Code. It's sold in tablet and injectable form. It does have some medical uses, but it's mostly used for bodybuilding and muscle building. The medical uses include for venous insufficiency and osteoporosis. So FINA is the world governing body for aquatic sports, and FINA's doping panel is the entity that had results management authority under this case. Fiol didn't make any submissions during his case to the FINA doping panel, but he did make a YouTube video, which I'll link to in the comments, where he, in Spanish, he proclaimed his innocence, but he also apologized to his family, his friends, his country, and his teammates. So going back to this case, according to the World Anti-Doping Code, they have a provision for when there are multiple violations. So the first issue is, remember, he had 6 positive tests, and the first issue is whether or not should be considered one anti-doping rule violation or more than one. According to the World Anti-Doping Code, multiple violations are considered one single anti-doping violation unless the anti-doping authority can establish that the athlete committed the second violation after being notified of the first one. So in this case, Fiol was notified of the adverse analytical findings of the first 3 samples before the samples were collected for the second 3. However, so the next step was to turn towards the scientific evidence, but the scientific evidence was inconclusive about when the stanozolol came into his system. The doctor that testified before the FINA doping panel couldn't say whether or not it was one injection or multiple injections, and admitted that it is likely that all 6 adverse analytical findings came from one dose of stanozolol. He admitted that that was possible. So we got one more violation in addition to the previous one he had from 2015. So the next thing to consider is whether or not it's intentional. Since Fiol didn't submit any evidence to the contrary, it was easy for the FINA anti-doping panel to conclude that it was intentional. So the next issue is the length of the sanction. And when you have a second or subsequent offense, there's a specific portion of the World Anti-Doping Code that deals with that. And that says that the length of the sanction is the greater of A, 6 months, B, 1/2 of the period of ineligibility for the second anti-doping violation, or C, twice the period that would otherwise be applicable if it were treated as a first violation. So using this method, it was pretty easy because both the first and second violations are 4 years. So the greater of that means 8 years. So because this was a second intentional violation, Fiol is sanctioned for 8 years. So let me know in the comments what you think about these cases. We've got some interesting twists to these. Next week, I'll be back with some more stories for you.